You will be taken from this place to a lawful prison.
And thence to a place of execution, and there you suffer death by hanging.
Capital punishment is the ultimate sentence. No appeal, no second chance, no room for error.
In 1944, the state of South Carolina executed George Stinney Jr. He was 14 years old, weighed less than 100 pounds, and was so small that some who witnessed his execution say he had to sit on a Bible.
Throughout history, certain death sentences have stood out not just for their brutality, but for the circumstances surrounding them. Some were based on trivial actions.
Executed a death row inmate named Marcellus Williams by lethal injection.
Others on flawed evidence, and a few on laws so extreme they defy belief. The cases you're about to hear happened in modern times, in our lifetimes, making them all the more disturbing. These aren't ancient histories. They're recent reminders of how quickly justice can become injustice. What makes a death sentence truly shocking. Tanggaraju Suppiah, executed for a phone call. Singapore has some of the strictest drug laws in the world. The city-state enforces mandatory death sentences for trafficking certain quantities of controlled substances, and they don't make many exceptions. In April 2023, 46-year-old Tanggaraju Suppiah was executed by hanging for his role in coordinating the delivery of roughly 1 kilogram of cannabis. His crime wasn't transporting the drugs himself or even handling them. He made phone calls to arrange the pickup of a package. That was enough for a death sentence under Singapore's Misuse of Drugs Act. Suppiah maintained his innocence throughout the process, claiming he had no knowledge that the package contained cannabis. His case drew attention for several troubling reasons beyond the severity of the punishment. During interrogations, he didn't have access to proper legal representation. He also wasn't provided with an adequate translator, despite English not being his first language. The confession he signed was given under these circumstances, raising questions about whether he fully understood what he was admitting to. International human rights organizations called for clemency, arguing that the death penalty for drug offenses violates international law. The United Nations has repeatedly stated that capital punishment should only be reserved for the most serious crimes, and drug offenses don't meet that threshold. But Singapore's government dismissed these concerns. They argued that strict drug laws are necessary to protect society and that exceptions would undermine their zero-tolerance policy. Suppiah's execution went ahead despite the appeals. His family was given just 4 days' notice. The case highlighted not just the harshness of Singapore's laws, but how little room exists for doubt once a conviction is secured. One phone call, one decision, and a life ended. Park Seok, music that cost a life. North Korea operates under some of the most restrictive cultural controls in the world. The regime sees foreign influence as a direct threat to its authority, and consuming media from South Korea is treated as a serious crime. In recent years, the government has cracked down particularly hard on K-pop, the globally popular music genre from the South. For most people, listening to music is harmless entertainment. In North Korea, it can get you killed. Park Seok was 22 years old when he was publicly executed in 2022. His crime was listening to and sharing 70 K-pop songs with friends. According to reports from defectors and sources inside the country, he was accused of distributing impure cultural content and undermining the state's ideological control. The regime views South Korean culture as a corrupting force, one that could weaken loyalty to Kim Jong-un and the ruling party. Public executions in North Korea serve a dual purpose. They eliminate perceived threats and send a message to everyone else. Park's execution was reportedly carried out in front of a crowd, likely including his own family and neighbors. The goal is to terrify people into compliance. According to testimonies, these executions are often brutal, with victims sometimes shot by firing squads while onlookers are forced to watch. What's particularly chilling about Park's case is the triviality of his offense. He didn't commit violence, he didn't steal, he listened to music. But in a totalitarian state where information is tightly controlled, even small acts of defiance are treated as existential threats. The punishment for consuming foreign media has only gotten harsher in recent years, with reports of young people receiving death sentences for watching South Korean films or TV shows. North Korea wants complete control over what its citizens see, hear, and think, and it's willing to kill to maintain that control. Marcellus Khalifa Williams, death despite doubt. Marcellus Williams spent over 2 decades on death row in Missouri before being executed in September 2024. His case became one of the most controversial in recent American history, not because of the crime he was convicted of, but because of the serious doubts about whether he actually committed it. Williams was sentenced to death for the 1998 stabbing murder of Leisha Gale, a former newspaper reporter, during a burglary. But the evidence tying him to the crime was questionable from the start. No physical evidence connected Williams to the murder scene. No fingerprints, no hair, no blood. DNA testing on the murder weapon, a knife found at the scene, excluded Williams. The prosecution's case relied almost entirely on the testimony of 2 people, a jailhouse informant and Williams' former girlfriend. Both had significant credibility issues. The informant received a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony. The girlfriend also received a reward of $10,000 in leniency in unrelated charges. Their stories contained inconsistencies, and neither could provide details that weren't already public knowledge. Years after the conviction, further DNA analysis confirmed that the DNA on the knife did not match Williams. His legal team argued this was clear evidence of innocence, or at minimum, reasonable doubt. But the state's response was that DNA alone wasn't enough to overturn the conviction. Courts ruled that other evidence, despite its weaknesses, was sufficient to uphold the sentence. The case drew widespread attention. Civil rights groups, religious leaders, and even the original prosecutor later called for Williams's execution to be halted. The prosecutor who originally sought the death penalty wrote letters urging clemency, citing concerns about racial bias in jury selection and the overall fairness of the trial. Despite all this, Missouri's governor and the courts refused to intervene. Williams was executed by lethal injection. His final words maintained his innocence. The case remains a stark example of how difficult it is to stop an execution once the legal process has concluded, even when new evidence suggests a terrible mistake. Zainab Sekhanvand, child bride on death row. Zainab Sekhanvand was just 17 years old when she was executed in Iran in 2018. Her story is a tragic illustration of how young women in some countries can be victims twice, first of the circumstances they're trapped in, and then of the legal systems that fail to protect them. Zainab was forced into marriage at the age of 15, becoming a child bride with no say in her future. Her husband was abusive, both physically and emotionally. She endured violence and control with little recourse or escape. When her husband was found dead, Zainab was arrested and accused of his murder. Under interrogation, without access to a lawyer, she confessed to the crime. Later, she recanted, saying the confession had been coerced and that her brother-in-law was the actual killer. There were indications that the brother-in-law had been involved and that he may have committed the murder after an altercation. But Iranian authorities didn't investigate this possibility thoroughly. Instead, they focused on Zainab, a young woman with no resources and no powerful allies. Iran's legal system allows for capital punishment at an age that much of the world considers childhood. Under Iranian law, girls can be held criminally responsible from the age of 9, boys from 15. This means children can face execution for crimes committed while they're still minors. Zainab's case highlights how domestic abuse victims can become criminalized when they try to escape or defend themselves. Her claims of abuse were largely ignored. The possibility that she acted in self-defense or had no involvement at all was dismissed. Her execution sparked international outrage. Human rights groups called it a clear violation of children's rights and criticized Iran's use of the death penalty against juveniles. But those protests came too late for Zainab. She was hanged in a prison in western Iran, her life ending before she even reached adulthood. Her case is a reminder of how vulnerable young women are in systems that deny them autonomy, protection, and justice. Robert Robertson. When autism looks like guilt. Robert Robertson sits on death row in Texas for the 2002 death of his 2-year-old daughter, Nikki. He was convicted of murder based on a medical theory that has since been widely discredited, shaken baby syndrome. Roberson's case has become a focal point in debates about outdated forensic science, wrongful convictions, and how neurological differences like autism can be misinterpreted as signs of guilt. When Nikki was brought to the hospital, doctors observed symptoms they believed indicated violent shaking, brain swelling, bleeding, and retinal hemorrhages. At the time, these signs were considered definitive proof of abuse. Roberson was accused of shaking his daughter to death, but there were other factors that weren't properly considered. Nikki had been sick in the days leading up to her death. She had pneumonia and had been prescribed medications that can cause respiratory problems. She had also fallen out of bed the night before. These details should have raised questions about alternative explanations for her injuries. What sealed Roberson's fate in the eyes of investigators and jurors wasn't just the medical evidence, it was his behavior. Roberson appeared emotionless, detached, and unresponsive when questioned about his daughter's death. To police and medical staff, this seemed like the reaction of a guilty man. But Roberson is autistic, a fact that wasn't understood or communicated during his trial. People with autism often process and express emotions differently. What looked like indifference was actually his neurological makeup, not evidence of guilt. Since his conviction, the science behind shaken baby syndrome has been challenged. Medical experts now recognize that the symptoms once attributed exclusively to violent shaking can have other causes, including accidental falls, illness, or underlying medical conditions. Multiple forensic pathologists have reviewed Roberson's case and concluded that the evidence does not support a murder conviction. Texas lawmakers, medical professionals, and advocacy groups have called for his sentence to be overturned. As of now, Roberson remains on death row, his case still pending. His situation raises a critical question. How many people have been convicted based on science that was never as solid as it seemed? Sarah Ismail, stoned for seeking freedom. In regions of Somalia controlled by the militant group Al-Shabaab, Sharia law is enforced with brutal severity. Al-Shabaab operates its own courts, handing down sentences that include amputations, beheadings, and stonings. Women, in particular, face extreme punishments for actions that would be considered basic human rights elsewhere. In 2021, Sarah Ismail was stoned to death for leaving her husband. The details of her case are sparse, as Al-Shabaab tightly controls information from the territories it governs. But reports from local sources indicate that Sarah was accused of adultery after separating from her husband. In some interpretations of Islamic law, a woman leaving her marriage without permission can be accused of moral crimes, even if she hasn't been unfaithful. The accusation alone was enough for a death sentence. Stoning is one of the most horrific forms of execution. The condemned person is buried up to their chest or neck, and a crowd throws stones until death occurs. It's slow, painful, and designed to be a public spectacle. These executions are intended to enforce social control, particularly over women. Al-Shabaab uses such punishments to terrorize communities into compliance with their strict interpretation of religious law. Sarah's execution highlights the intersection of gender-based violence and extremist ideology. Women in Al-Shabaab-controlled areas have few rights and little protection. Domestic abuse is common, and women who try to leave abusive marriages risk being accused of crimes themselves. There's no due process, no real trial, just a ruling from a religious court that doubles as a tool of oppression. Sarah's story is one of many, though most go unreported. Women continue to face these extreme punishments in silence, their voices suppressed by fear and isolation. Derek Bentley, let him have it. In 1953, Derek Bentley became one of the last people executed in the United Kingdom before the country abolished the death penalty. His case remains one of the most controversial in British legal history, not because of what he did, but because of what he didn't do. Bentley was 19 years old, but he had the mental capacity of a child. He had epilepsy and a learning disability, and he struggled to read and write. On the night of November 2, 1952, he and a 16-year-old friend, Christopher Craig, attempted to break into a warehouse in South London. Police arrived while they were on the roof. Bentley was quickly apprehended, but Craig had a gun. During the confrontation, Bentley allegedly shouted, "Let him have it, Chris." Moments later, Craig fired, killing a police officer. The question that has haunted the case ever since is what Bentley meant by those words. Did he mean shoot him, or did he mean give him the gun? The ambiguity was never resolved, but it didn't matter in court. Craig, who actually pulled the trigger, was too young to be executed under British law. Bentley, who never held a weapon and was already in police custody when the shot was fired, was not. He was convicted of murder under the principle of joint enterprise, which holds that participants in a crime can be held responsible for each other's actions. Despite his intellectual disabilities, despite not firing the gun, despite being held by police at the time of the shooting, Bentley was sentenced to death. Public outcry was immediate. Petitions were signed, protests were held, and there were calls for mercy. Even members of the jury later expressed regret. But the execution went ahead. Bentley was hanged on January 28, 1953. Decades later, his conviction was overturned. In 1998, the Court of Appeal ruled that the trial had been deeply flawed and that the judge's instructions to the jury were biased. Bentley received a posthumous pardon, but it came 45 years too late. His case became a symbol of the dangers of capital punishment, especially when applied to vulnerable individuals who lack the capacity to fully understand or defend themselves. George Stinney, the youngest modern execution. George Stinney was 14 years old when he was executed in South Carolina in 1944. He remains the youngest person to be executed in the United States in the 20th century. His trial lasted just 2 hours. He had no legal defense, no chance to call witnesses, and no opportunity to appeal. He was convicted by an all-white jury of murdering 2 white girls, ages 7 and 11, whose bodies had been found in a ditch near his home. The evidence against Stinney was minimal. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. No murder weapon was ever found. The case relied entirely on a confession that police claimed Stinney had given. But there was no written record of this confession, no recording, and no lawyer present during the interrogation. Stinney's family insisted he was innocent and that he had been with them at the time of the murders. But in 1940 South Carolina, a black teenager's word meant nothing against the accusations of white authorities. The trial took place in a segregated courtroom. Stinney's parents weren't allowed to attend. His court-appointed lawyer, a tax attorney with no experience in criminal defense, did almost nothing to defend him. There was no cross-examination of witnesses, no challenge to the alleged confession, and no investigation into other suspects. The jury deliberated for just 10 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. Less than 3 months after his arrest, George Stinney was strapped into an electric chair. He was so small that the guards had to use a phone book to boost him up so the electrodes would reach. The execution was botched. The mask didn't fit properly, and witnesses reported that it slipped off during the electrocution, revealing his face. He was a child killed by the state, based on a case that wouldn't meet even the most basic standards of justice. 70 years later, in 2014, a judge vacated Stinney's conviction, ruling that his constitutional rights had been violated and that the trial was fundamentally unfair. But no amount of legal vindication can undo what was done. George Stinney's execution remains a stain on the American justice system, a reminder of how race, age, and power can determine who lives and who dies. Mahmoud Asghari and Ayaz Marhoni, executed for being teenagers. In July 2005, 2 Iranian teenagers, Mahmoud Asghari and Ayaz Marhoni, were publicly hanged in the city of Mashhad. The official charges were rape and kidnapping, but international human rights groups questioned whether those were the real reasons. Reports suggested that the boys, who were 15 and 16 at the time of their alleged crimes, were actually executed for engaging in consensual sexual activity with each other. In Iran, same-sex relations are punishable by death. The details of the case remain murky. Iranian authorities claimed the boys had raped a 13-year-old, but there was little transparency in the judicial process. Some sources indicated that the boys confessed under duress, possibly after being tortured. Others pointed out inconsistencies in the charges and questioned whether the boys had adequate legal representation. Human rights organizations like Amnesty International raised concerns that the execution was actually for homosexuality, not rape, and that the rape charges were added to justify the death penalty under international scrutiny. What's clear is that the boys were minors when they were arrested, and they were executed while still teenagers. Iran is one of the few countries in the world that continues to execute juvenile offenders, despite international treaties prohibiting the practice. The public nature of the execution was also significant. The boys were hanged from a crane in front of a crowd, a method designed to maximize humiliation and fear. Photos of the execution circulated widely, sparking global condemnation. LGBT rights groups highlighted the case as evidence of Iran's persecution of gay individuals. The Iranian government denied that the execution had anything to do with homosexuality, but the lack of transparency and the severity of the punishment raised serious doubts. The case remains controversial, with conflicting narratives depending on the source. What isn't in dispute is that 2 teenagers were killed by the state, their lives cut short in a public display meant to enforce obedience. Troy Davis, the case of recanting witnesses. Troy Davis was executed in Georgia in 2011 after spending more than 20 years on death row. His case became a global cause, with millions of people calling for his execution to be stopped. The reason was simple. There was serious doubt about whether he was guilty. Davis was convicted in 1991 of shooting and killing a police officer, Mark McPhail, in a Savannah parking lot. But the evidence against him was shaky from the start. There was no physical evidence linking Davis to the crime. No murder weapon was recovered, no DNA, no fingerprints. The conviction relied entirely on witness testimony. 9 people testified that they saw Davis shoot McPhail, but over the years, 7 of those 9 witnesses recanted their testimony. Some said they had been coerced by police. Others admitted they hadn't actually seen the shooting and had only repeated what they heard. One of the remaining witnesses was a man who some people believe was the actual shooter. Despite these recantations, the courts refused to overturn Davis's conviction. Under U.S. law, new evidence of innocence isn't always enough to stop an execution. Courts generally defer to the original verdict unless there's overwhelming proof of error. In Davis's case, judges ruled that the recantations weren't sufficient to meet that standard, but the situation troubled even some who supported the death penalty. Former FBI Director William Sessions, a conservative law and order figure, called for the execution to be halted, saying the case was too uncertain. International figures, including Pope Benedict XVI and former President Jimmy Carter, appealed for clemency. Amnesty International organized campaigns. Hundreds of thousands of people signed petitions. But Georgia moved forward. Davis was executed by lethal injection on September 21, 2011. His last words maintained his innocence and urged the McPhail family to continue searching for the truth. The case highlighted a troubling reality. Once someone is convicted, the system becomes extremely resistant to revisiting that decision, even when new information suggests a mistake. Rayhaneh Jabari, self-defense as murder. Rayhaneh Jabari was 19 years old when she was arrested in Iran in 2007. She had killed a man, and she never denied it, but the circumstances of the killing told a very different story than the one the Iranian legal system chose to believe. Jabari was an interior designer, and the man she killed, Morteza Abdullahi Sarbandi, was a former intelligence officer. He had hired her to redesign his office, or so she thought. When she arrived, she realized she had been lured into a trap. According to Jabari, Sarbandi tried to rape her. In the struggle, she grabbed a knife and stabbed him. She called for help, and she cooperated with police when they arrived, but instead of being treated as a victim defending herself, she was charged with murder. Iranian authorities claimed the killing was premeditated, suggesting she had lured Sarbandi to the location to kill him. They provided no evidence for this theory, but it didn't matter. The burden was on Jabari to prove her innocence. And in Iran's legal system, claims of self-defense in cases involving sexual assault are often dismissed. Jabari's trial was deeply flawed. She wasn't allowed to present key evidence. Witnesses who could corroborate her story weren't called. The victim's family had significant influence, and under Iranian law, they had the right to demand her execution. Despite international appeals, including from human rights organizations and foreign governments, Jabari was executed by hanging in 2014. Her case became a symbol of how women are treated in Iran's justice system. Victims of sexual violence often face blame rather than support. Self-defense is rarely recognized when the victim is a woman and the attacker is a man, especially if the man has social or political status. Jabari's mother later said that her daughter went to the gallows believing she had done the right thing, that she had fought back against an attacker. But the system saw her as a murderer. She was executed not for committing a crime, but for refusing to be a victim. Cameron Todd Willingham, bad science, fatal consequences. Cameron Todd Willingham was executed in Texas in 2004 for setting a fire that killed his 3 young daughters. He maintained his innocence until the very end, insisting that the fire was an accident. For years, his claims were dismissed, but after his execution, experts re-examined the evidence, and what they found was damning. The science used to convict Willingham was completely wrong. The fire occurred in 1991 in Willingham's home in Corsicana, Texas. Investigators at the scene concluded that the fire had been deliberately set based on burn patterns, the presence of accelerants, and other indicators. This was the standard approach to arson investigation at the time. Willingham was arrested, tried, and convicted almost entirely on the testimony of fire investigators who claimed the evidence pointed to arson. There was no physical evidence tying him to starting the fire, no motive that made sense, and no history of violence toward his children. But the fire investigation was treated as definitive proof. Years later, fire science had advanced, and experts began reviewing old arson cases. When they looked at the Willingham case, they were shocked. The burn patterns that investigators had claimed were evidence of arson were actually consistent with accidental fires. The so-called indicators of accelerant use were naturally occurring phenomena. The investigative techniques used in 1991 were outdated and unreliable, debunked by modern standards. Multiple fire scientists concluded that there was no evidence the fire had been intentionally set. This revelation came too late for Willingham. Before his execution, his lawyers tried to present this new evidence, but Texas courts refused to delay the execution. Governor Rick Perry, who had the power to grant clemency, declined to intervene. Willingham was executed by lethal injection on February 17, 2004. In the years since, the case has been extensively investigated, and the consensus among fire experts is clear. Willingham was almost certainly innocent. He was executed based on junk science, a tragic reminder that even the most confident expert testimony can be disastrously wrong. When drug possession equals death. In dozens of countries around the world, drug offenses can carry the death penalty. Not drug trafficking involving violence, not cartel leadership, but possession or small-scale dealing. Nations like China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, and Vietnam regularly execute people for drug-related crimes. The numbers are staggering. According to human rights organizations, hundreds of people are executed each year for drug offenses, and the true figure is likely much higher because many countries don't report execution statistics. The rationale is usually framed as a deterrent. Governments argue that harsh penalties are necessary to combat drug abuse and protect society. But research consistently shows that the death penalty doesn't effectively deter drug crime. Trafficking and addiction are driven by complex factors, including poverty, demand, and organized crime networks. Executing low-level offenders doesn't disrupt these systems. It just creates a revolving door of people facing death for being at the bottom of the supply chain. What's particularly troubling is how disproportionate these sentences are. In some countries, possessing a few grams of a controlled substance can result in execution, while violent crimes like assault or even some forms of homicide receive lighter sentences. The focus on drug offenses often reflects political priorities rather than a reasoned approach to justice. It's also worth noting that many of those executed for drug crimes are poor, marginalized, or foreign nationals who lack the resources to mount a strong defense. International law is clear. The death penalty should be reserved for the most serious crimes, and drug offenses don't meet that standard. Yet countries continue to carry out these executions, often in the face of global criticism. For the individuals caught in these systems, the consequences are final. A moment of desperation, a bad decision, or even just being in the wrong place can lead to a death sentence. And once that sentence is carried out, there's no going back. The arbitrary nature of justice. Geography determines who lives and who dies. If you commit the same crime in different places, you might face a fine in one country, a prison sentence in another, and execution in a third. The death penalty isn't applied based on universal standards of justice. It's shaped by politics, culture, and the resources available to the accused. Where you are, who you are, and how much money you have can be more important than what you actually did. Wealth plays a massive role. People with money can hire experienced lawyers, expert witnesses, and investigators. They can afford appeals and lengthy court battles. Those without resources often get overworked public defenders, minimal investigation, and little chance to challenge the evidence against them. Studies have shown that defendants who can't afford private counsel are far more likely to receive death sentences. It's not that they're more guilty, it's that they're more vulnerable. Race and ethnicity matter too. In the United States, statistics show that people of color, particularly black defendants, are more likely to be sentenced to death than white defendants for similar crimes. The race of the victim also influences sentencing. Cases involving white victims are more likely to result in death sentences than cases involving victims of color. These disparities reveal deep biases in how justice is administered, biases that should have no place in decisions about life and death. Then there's the question of legal representation and trial quality. Some death penalty cases involve trials that last only hours, with minimal evidence and rushed proceedings. Others involve questionable forensic science, unreliable witnesses, or coerced confessions. Once a death sentence is handed down, overturning it becomes extremely difficult, even when new evidence emerges. The system is designed to move forward, not to correct itself. And when mistakes are made, they're often irreversible. These stories aren't outliers. They're examples of a system that's deeply flawed, shaped by human error, bias, and the uncomfortable truth that justice is never truly blind. Every execution carries the risk of being wrong, and once it's done, there's no taking it back. The cases we've looked at here share one thing in common. They raise the question of whether the death penalty can ever be applied fairly. And for many of the people who've studied these cases, the answer is troubling.